My father was a fine man, I'd like to think it so. Oh, my father was the King of England. But my father, he was absent for so long, how could I know the man who was the King of England?
Magna Carta is the foundation of our liberties. It's why we have rights. That may seem like an eccentric thing to say about a document that's 800 years old this year. It's so ancient that it was written in Latin on vellum, sealed in wax. It has no formatting. We're lucky there's any punctuation.
So this was the beginning of our dream. This is the video that we used to make a pitch on Kickstarter to raise $75,000 to make Magna Carta.
The law wasn't perfect back in 1215, of course. It had to be refined and adapted. The protective circle that it drew was too narrow, sometimes tragically so. But within that circle, there was a political order worth cherishing, worth defending, worth extending, and worth imitating.
You know, the funny thing is when he recorded that pitch in January, he actually did have pretty much all the documentary in his head already. He told me that, and I kind of had to believe him, but it was true.
Even in most of Europe in subsequent centuries. How did it work in practice? How does it affect us today? What threats and challenges exist to this system now? And how can we be sure that we will pass on to our posterity the blessings of liberty that we inherited from our ancestors? Please help me to tell the remarkable story of Magna Carta, the cornerstone and foundation of our rights and liberties.
And it worked. We not only reached our goal, but we surpassed it a little bit, which was, of course, extremely exciting. Now, the next step, preparing the trip. What else are you doing?
And figuring out how we get from point A to point B in the UK. We're doing these maps of the travel on the various days and making sure that we do not get lost and wander into the marshes of Athelney, except intentionally in quest of King Alfred.
Mm-hmm.
Who, by the way, we have a statue of here.
Where?
So that statue and this statue.
Where is that one?
This one is in Winchester.
And why is Alfred the Great such a big part of the documentary?
Alfred the Great is the iconic king who served his people instead of lording it over them. And the story of Alfred and the Cakes, which was known throughout the English-speaking world for almost 1,000 years, was the classic expression of the humility of the monarch and his duty to his people. And Alfred is a real character. He's the only English king who's known as the Great, and the only Canadian king, therefore, who's known as the Great. Fought off the Danes in the worst part of the Dark Ages, gave his people just laws, and taught himself Latin as an adult, so that he could translate important books into Anglo-Saxon. He was the model king in so many ways, and he's a figure who just doesn't have an equivalent in most political cultures.
So off we went. We flew to England. We got there, of course, very early on a Saturday morning, not having slept too much on the plane, but let's not dwell on that. We went straight from there. We hooked up with our camera guy who was already in London, and we went to Runnymede for the recording. The first time we went to Runnymede, we went there twice, but on the very first day, this was the opening segment that John wanted to do, and part of his closing statements that he wanted to record right away and know where he wanted to know where this documentary would start and where it would end, and that would help him a lot along the way in the 8 days in Britain and how to film the various segments he had to do. After Runnymede, we got in the car and drove all the way to Wantage, which is the birthplace of Alfred the Great, and we did a piece there. And while John was busy doing his hit on Alfred the Great, I was looking after one of our kids who was being sick at the time. I did not realize this, but she was the first one to get a stomach bug that was going to afflict each and every one of us over the next few days. But, you know, things have to keep going, and off we went after Wantage and a quick dinner. We went to Uffington, where John wanted to do a piece at the Vale of Whitehorse, for some reflections on the long sweep of history, but Mr. Howling Wind had other ideas. Here's a clip that we took there that we could not use in the documentary, but you get to see it here.
One of the baffling things about this story is the sheer time scale, how long it's been going on. Behind me, the Uffington Castle. It's an Iron Age hill fort. Into the side has carved the famous Uffington White Horse, featured in Chesterton's Ballad of White Horse about King Alfred. That carving was already old when Alfred was king in the 9th century. And one can imagine this being one of the last Saxon strongholds to fall to the Normans. Before that, one of the last Romanized British strongholds to fall to the Saxons. Perhaps this is Arthur's fabled Baden Hill, and before that, one of the last Celtic strongholds to fall to the Romans. But it's not just a bunch of obscure battles. There is a thread here of the fight for liberty, going back into the mists of time. There's an interesting book by Alan McFarlane. It's called The Origins of English Individualism. Now, he was a kind of orthodox sociologist, a good smattering of Marxism, and he assumed that all societies went through the same transitional stages in much the same way, in the same sequence. It just happened earlier in England. But the more closely he looked at his sources and compared them, the more he realized that no matter how far back he went, there was something different about the English, clearly going back before the Norman conquest. Maybe Tacitus had something when he talked about the Germanic tribes and their system of self-government, and then that somehow merged with the Roman concept of the rule of law. The point is, there is something different about liberty in the Anglosphere as far back as we look. It is an ancient heritage and a precious one.
So by that point, we've been up since a regular Friday in Ottawa, then we flew overnight to England, not sleeping that much on the plane. Then we've had a full day in starting in London and driving around all the way to the outskirts of Winchester. Look it up on a map. England's not very big, but still, that was a fair bit of travel. We stopped at our first hotel, a fantastic Days Inn, one of many Days Inn on that trip, on the side of the highway, and it was fine. As you can see here on the picture from their website, this is not a very luxurious hotel, but it was fine. There was only one thing, though. There were rats in the parking lot. I'm happy to say that the rats did not make it inside the hotel. There was no sign of any rodent anywhere inside, but boy, that parking lot sure had a bunch. And then being very tired, very jet lagged, very not really quite ready to cope with all the quirky things that one finds in England, we didn't know what to make of this. That was the taps in the bathroom. We actually thought they were broken, but no, it was just us not being able to understand British taps, and we eventually figured it out and took a big shower and then went straight to bed and slept until very early the next morning when we had to get up and go to Winchester to do another piece on Alfred the Great in a very, very, very cold parking lot in the center of town. It was a very pretty town, mind you. It was a Sunday morning, very quiet, and then there was a group of cyclists that gathered around us. That was evidently their gathering point before their ride that morning, and they were looking at us a bit funny. But we did our piece, and on we went from there. Our next stop was Salisbury. Number 1, there's a big church there where the prisoner of conscience, the window of the prisoner of conscience is, where John wanted to do a special segment about. But the very special reason why we went to Salisbury is that one of the original 1215 Magna Carta is there. And wow, what an experience that was. After the cathedral and the second kid getting sick, off we went to Old Sarum nearby, this very, very ancient hill fort where John did a couple of special little segments, sometimes interrupted by the wind, sometimes interrupted by a very annoying airplane.
Very soil here that so many generations have lived here and hoped and died and fought and raised children.
Yeah.
And from there we moved towards a place, a very obscure place. I think John is probably one of 3 people in the world who care about this, but there's this thing called Egbert's Stone, and it has to do with a battle which Alfred the Great, one of those turning point battles involving Alfred the Great, and he was determined to find it. It was in a field somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and at that point I started getting really, really, really sick too. So I can't really tell you exactly how the search for Egbert's Stone went, because I was busy doing other things at the time, but I think John managed to record something that we ended up not using in the documentary, but here it is anyway.
The Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Kingston Deverill is almost unimaginably old. It seems to date from Norman times. In its churchyard are tilting tombstones and cracked vaults, the very inscriptions long since worn away beyond any hope of reading them. And yet, this ancient church is a newcomer relative to what we're actually here looking for. Egbert Stone, marking the spot where Alfred the Great really did rally his men before winning a pivotal battle in 877 that turned the tide against the Danish invaders and saved Saxon liberty. The kind of victory the Romanized Britons had never managed to win against the Saxons when they were the barbarian invaders 3 centuries earlier. It ought to be a site of national and even international historical importance, marked, preserved, and quite possibly characterized by the very high fees that often are featured at British historical sites. Unfortunately for Egbert and his stone, it has received no such treatment. There it sits, or so I'm told. I found it via an internet search from another continent. I located it here by following an aerial photograph, and it's in the middle of a junkyard. Now, of course, that may not be the original Egbert stone, or possibly it was moved. It might have been in a different configuration. Obviously, the events of the Dark Ages are a little obscure, and we're not really quite sure. But this is the best guess for what is Egbert Stone, and again, the best guess for where the historic rally took place. And I cannot help thinking, even if I understand, as Tim Severin said in one of his books when he was trying to recreate mythical voyages, things never get smaller in the telling. So whenever you're looking for something that's in a legend, you'll find that the real thing is smaller than the legendary version. Even so, really, Egbert Stone deserves better than this.
So that was pretty much it for that day. Then we drove a long time to be near Evesham in Worcester to be ready for our next day. The next morning, of course, we got up, went to the wonderful, beautiful little town of Evesham to tape a segment about Simon de Montfort. Then we went to Worcester Cathedral, which is, of course, where bad King John is buried there. And then we went, it took us a while to find this, but John was determined to go to the site of Powick Bridge. And we went driving around, looking at it on the GPS. Nobody really knew exactly where that was, but somebody here, and that was me, managed almost to trip over the field, and there was a small plaque saying that this was the site, in fact, of that Battle of Powick Bridge, and John was very happy about that, and he went walking into a field where really this is a place for people walking their dogs, but there he was, knee-deep, literally, into long grass to talk about that episode of the English Civil War. After Powick Bridge, we drove a long time past London on the way to Dover, or close to Dover, where we finally achieved the trifecta of sick kids overnight. And then that only left 2 more adults to get that stomach bug. Oh, don't worry, they'll come in their turn. And so we got up the next morning and drove to Dover. Fantastic. Beautiful castle, not just for the obvious reasons that it's a very, very cool castle, but what they've done inside, the recreation, everything, the keep, the king's bedroom, the main room where they had their meals, the whole thing, every single detail seems to have been thought through. You're free to walk around there, sit on things, touch things. It's just a wonderful recreation. I'm just sorry we did not have time to go inside and film everything there. After that, we went to Shepherd's Neame, and not very far from that. That's a very ancient brewery where they were, of course, doing a special Magna Carta beer, so we went there for that. And then off we went to Canterbury to do a couple of segments on Stephen Langton and another one on Thomas Becket. And this is the part where John, of course, finally got that bug. But I'll bet you that if you watch a documentary, you'll never know when exactly he was sick, because if you thought I was stubborn, he's even more stubborn than I was, and he was not going to let this bug stop him. So we managed to do it. Then we drove all the way to a place in the middle of nowhere that was close to where we wanted to go the next morning in Tittles Hall to visit Sir Edward Cook. Now, Edward Cook is one of the biggest heroes of this whole story, and as you can imagine, we were very happy and excited to be in the church where he and his family are buried. And it's a very, very tiny, very charming church in the middle, literally, of nowhere. You thought I've been saying the middle of nowhere for a while now, but this The roads to get to Tittles Hall were, from a North American's perspective, very, very funny. They were so narrow. My driveway is at least twice as big as the regional road that we had to take to get to Tittles Hall. But all that aside, we really did have a wonderful time there, and we recorded a number of pieces that most of which were used in the documentary, but we also recorded a number of things there maybe for possible use later, because face it, when do you think we'll be able to get back up to Tittles Hall? We didn't know. So we did take our time there. There was one time that we didn't run around like crazy on a super tight schedule. Then we took also the time to go and have a nice lunch at the nearby Dabbling Duck. And if you're ever in Norfolk, I really recommend that place. Very wonderful food, not even that expensive, just pleasant people. Just the whole experience was lovely. And then we drove down to London, which was, the drive down was fine. It's just finding our own apartment that we had rented in the center of the city at rush hour. Well, that wasn't quite as fun as all that, especially driving on the wrong side of the road, but we made it somehow, and then we got ready for the next day. So now you're probably wondering, so when's the last person going to get sick? Haha. That was that day. The day in London, our camera guy got the bug pretty bad, so I had to take over filming for the early part of the day until he recovered enough in the afternoon to come and join us. And it was a very, very busy day, and there our kids really did earn their titles as special assistants, because they rallied around and they helped us carry the equipment through the streets of London. We must have walked something, I probably exaggerate, but it feels like we walked about 10 miles that day, and they came along and they hustled and they did all the work anyway without complaining too much. So they did get some extra bonus points from that day. And again, London was a wonderful, beautiful day. We had splendid weather. It was just almost too good to be true. And we finished all our filming there during that day, as you can see from the images shown. Pretty much all that we filmed in London, we ended up using in the documentary. So if you've already watched the documentary, you're not really getting much that you haven't seen in this particular segment. But wow, we unfortunately did not have time to do any touristy kind of thing in London. John and I had been there a couple of times before, of course, but the kids had never been there, and they wanted to go and look at the Queen's Palace and so on. But unfortunately, this will have to wait for another trip. We were now done with London and drove in the morning to Windsor, where we did a segment or 3 at Windsor Castle. We even got to see the changing of the guard, which was kind of neat, especially for the kids. They enjoyed that part. After that, we went to the nearby Windsor and Eton Brewery, another place where we're making special Magna Carta beer made with ingredients that would have been around at the time of King John and Magna Carta. And we, of course, bought some. It's part of the research, right? We have to test these things, and it's different. It's a bit syrupy. There were no hops, of course, back in 1215, so that gives you a beer that's kind of flat-ish, but very, very tasty. After that brewery trip, we then went to Odium, not too far from there, where we met at the castle with those wonderful musicians whose music became the soundtrack of our movie, really. Jenny Lockyer and Matthew Foster, and they performed for us one of their songs, America, at Odium Castle, so we got to be able to film that, and I'm going to show it to you in a minute, and what we did there. And then we went to the Odium Church, not very far from there, where we did another couple of segments, including one with living history reenactors who were playing monks and people who actually did calligraphy, rewriting Magna Carta in the Norman French. So that was really fascinating to hear them talk about how they'd learned to do this, why they cared about it, why they did the things that they did. And it was just very charming. We also had a very good interview with a specialist, a historian, a specialist of that period. So all in all, Odium was absolutely one of the most charming spots on our tour. One of the last ones too, because we were almost done with our trip to England. There was one more day after this, and I'll tell you in a minute, right after I let you listen to this live performance of America.
2, 3. Pass the river, cross the meadow, through a gate into America. A sense of peace, despite constant planes on their way to America. Upon the hill, proud and high, scarlet oak stands, shelters words in Portland stone. Kennedy's remembered here, his name carved clearly in memoriam. And Magna Carta went across the water, the notion of liberty founded America. We took our ways and the customs into the wilds of a new world. What of the native people of America, and how we claimed in liberty's name all those people chained and shipped across the sea. But we believed our beliefs were justified, our actions even sanctified for centuries. We had notions of liberty, definitions of equality, and didn't stop at America. Explorers found new land, Magna Carta in one hand, a raised sword in the other. And will we ever learn at all? History goes in circles and around we run. We stumble in the dark, but then we find the sun. In a time of conflict, they came to reflect, friends and allies from America. Our war for liberty against the threat of tyranny saw them come to this America, and on nearby English land now their memorial stands to a far gone distant deed. When darkness threatened light and the Allies joined our fight, they came to Runnymede, a piece of English ground given to our friends across the ocean in America. An invitation, the contemplation here in this acre of America, for freedom and its survival, protection from our rivals. Who do we look to? Soldiers, teachers, presidents, me and you, me and you, me and you.
For our last day in England, we got a very special treat. We got to go visit Daniel Hannan at his house, where he made us tea, of course, and gave us a wonderful, wonderful interview that we use, I think, every second just about of what he said in our documentary. He really, really gave us some excellent material, and we're very grateful to have been able to spend an hour with him at his house. From there, we drove back in the direction of Heathrow, of course, to catch our flight back to North America. But on the way, we stopped again at Runnymede to record some extra little bits that John wanted to do, maybe some of his... He wanted to redo parts of his introduction and also parts of his conclusion, having now done the filming in England. And he also recorded a couple of other special little clips that were not used in the documentary, but you guys might see some of those at some other point in the future. And from there, it was a flight back home to America, where we took some time to recover a little bit, and then a month later we left again, but this time by car, to do the North American portion of our trip, with the first stop in Boston, where we went to Bunker Hill Monument. That was an excellent little trip there too, and then we moved on to another part of Boston, where we went to the Boston Ship and Tea Party Museum, where John got to throw some replica tea in the harbor, and he had a grand old time doing that. After Boston, we drove to Philadelphia. We did a segment at Independence Hall, another one at Washington Square. From there, we drove to Gettysburg. The next day, we went to the battlefield, did several segments there, of course, on that battle, but also on other aspects, slavery, and other aspects of the fight for liberty. Then we drove to Virginia. The next morning, we went to see the ships and the settlements at Jamestown. Another very fantastic recreation there, by the way, if you're ever in the area, especially if you have kids and you want to teach them about the founding of America. I highly, highly recommend it. From there, then we drove to Washington, D.C., where we then went to the Capitol building to record a segment on with the backdrop of the gold replica that they have there of Magna Carta. And then that was it for the day. That was it for this trip pretty much. The next day we had a couple of more hours in Washington, D.C. to there I confess we did do a couple of touristy things. We were pretty much done, and we did some shooting some other segments that again we did not use in the documentary but may use at some point later. But then we took the opportunity to just relax a little bit, go to the Smithsonian and enjoy a nice lunch and ice cream before getting in the car and driving back towards Ottawa. And that was pretty much it for our trip. We then did one more segment in Ottawa when the Magna Carta exhibit came to the Museum of History, and then we also went to Toronto to tape a segment at Montgomery's Tavern. That was a little bit later, and then that was pretty much it. Then it was the editing and the release. So now you have the story of how we brought you Magna Carta.
And didn't stop at America. Explorers found new land, Magna Carta in one hand, a raised sword in the other. And will we ever learn at all? History goes in circles.